Ferrari, the most successful racing team in Grand Prix history, the Big Red Car, some of the biggest names in the sport, and the almost mythical status of Enzo Ferrari. Every legend and myth has to begin somewhere. Now, I've been a Ferrari fan for a number of years, and during that time I've never really, while I love the history, I've not necessarily thought about in the beginning how the legend that has become Ferrari ended up where it has now. At Goodwood a couple of years ago, I saw a 1930s Alfa Romeo there, sporting the prancing horse. And I was looking at that picture again recently. That got me thinking about, how did it all start? How did a young lad from Modena become the most famous name in motorsport history and one of the biggest brands, if not the biggest brand in the world? So this is what's inspired this video, taking a look back at where it all began. Enzo Ferrari was born in 1898. His father, Alfredo, worked as a structural metal constructor in Modena, and they lived above his workshop. In 1908, Alfredo took his two boys, Dino and Enzo, to see their first motor race in Bologna. And Enzo fell in love, absolutely, seeing the Fiats charging around the track, the sounds of the engines, the cars as they swept through the corner. Being a bit of a dreamer, he had ideas then about wanting to be a racing driver. Enzo was a bit of a dreamer and struggled at school a little bit as a result of this. But from what I've heard, or what I've read, he seemed to have a happy childhood. Unfortunately, in 1914, World War I broke out. In 1916, Dino ended up being conscripted into the army. Within a couple of months of that, their father had died from sickness. By the end of the year, Dino had also died of sickness. And at the start of 1917, Enzo got conscripted into the army as well. He ended up shoeing mules in the army. He'd wanted to work with the motor vehicle section, showing them things, saying that he'd worked with engineering and what have you, but they turned him down. And by the end of 1917, he'd fallen ill as well and left to potentially die. But 1918 rolled around and he was recovering and eventually discharged from the army. Shopping around for a little while, trying to find jobs, trying various different jobs, none of them really being what he wanted. He'd got a letter of commendation from his former commanding officer and took that to Turin to see Fiat. But unfortunately, Fiat weren't impressed by it. They had a city full of ex-soldiers that they could take their pick from. So he was left despondent. So we can imagine Enzo sitting there, family in pieces, his father's business having collapsed. Himself nearly died from illness. And Fiat, who he had looked up to and wanted to race for, had turned him down flat. There's two ways you go from that. One is you just sigh and try and muddle through life as best as possible and not let it crush you. Or in Enzo's case, it completely lit a fire underneath him and he had a new goal. He was going to become a racing driver, whatever it cost, whatever it took. And by 1920, he'd sold his father's old workshop, spent the money to buy a second-hand Alfa Romeo, and was working for a company, sometimes racing for CMN, in Milan. And while he got into the racing circles and started mixing with the racing people in the racing world, that led him to the door of another guy who managed to get him an Alfa Romeo. And at Alfa, he quickly made a name for himself, competing in small events like hill climbs and stuff, but not doing too badly. And coming to the attention of some of the management at Alfa Romeo. When Alfa Romeo wanted to build a Grand Prix car, he was tasked with poaching some of the people from Fiat to try and build it for them. And that Grand Prix car would go on to be the Alfa Romeo P2, which was arguably the best Grand Prix car of the 1920s. In 1923, Enzo would take victory at the Circuit di Savio, And afterwards, he had dinner with the sponsors of the event, who were the parents of the First World War fighter pilot Francesco Baracca. His symbol was the Cavallino Rampante, and as an emblem of good luck and good fortune to Enzo Ferrari, his parents allowed Ferrari to use it. Eventually, it wouldn't appear on the cars until 1932, by which point it had a yellow background as well to symbolise the city of Modena. But it's run on Ferrari, with the exception of a period we'll talk about in a little while, it's run on Ferraris ever since. During the rest of the 20s, when he wasn't racing, he was working as a salesman for Alfa Romeo, and salesman and the ability to sell things was where Enzo Ferrari really took off and did well out of it. Well enough so that by 1929 he managed to set up the Scuderia Ferrari, which is his own race team, using primarily Alfa Romeos. At one point they had about 40 drivers in their stable. But by 1932, with the Great Depression going on, Alfa Romeo themselves were struggling for money, and they handed over their works racing outfit to Enzo Ferrari and asked him to run it. So Alfa Romeo works outfit raced under the Scuderia Ferrari banner. In 1933, Ferrari got his hands on the works Alfa Romeo's P3 cars, and in 1933 and in 1934 they were incredibly strong. As well as that, they also got their hands on the Alfa Romeo works drivers, which was a pretty potent lineup during that period. Given access to drivers like Tazio Nivellari, Giuseppe Campari, Achille Vasi, and Louis Chiron, which were some of the best known racing drivers of that period. A couple of them would actually go on to race into the early 50s, Louis Chiron featuring in certainly the 1950 season, if not the 51 season, although Chiron of course was best known for being a Bugatti driver. 33, they basically won the title. 34, they were strong as well. They had victories in Targa Florio, Monaco, Tripoli, Casablanca, and a 1-2-3 at the French Grand Prix as well. Unfortunately, this would all come to an end in 1935, when the German state bankrolled teams like Mercedes and Auto Union coming to the fore with just the sheer technology and money they had available to them, making it very difficult for some of the other teams who didn't have state backing to be able to compete with them. Although this didn't prevent Tazio Nivellari from getting what some people would consider to be his best victory in appalling conditions in the 1935 German Grand Prix at Nürburgring. He got one of the last and one of the best wins for Alfa Romeo. Tazio Nivellari was Enzo Ferrari's favourite driver. One of the roads next to the factory in Maranello is called Via Nuvellari. When Enzo first met Jules Villeneuve, the driver he compared him to was Tazio Nivellari, and that doesn't get a lot higher than that as far as praise goes. Enzo himself hadn't raced since 1932 after the birth of his son Dino. And as the 30s progressed, with the rise of the Germans and the financial support and the technology they had available to them, it became harder and harder for the Scuderia Ferrari to win races. And this tied in with Alfa getting more financial support and a new management structure in place. And Alfa did to Ferrari similar to what Walter Wolff did to Frank Williams in the 1970s. Well, basically they bought the team out from under him. Enzo ended up having to sell his team back to the works Alfa Romeo outfit, and within 2 years he'd left himself, whether it was because he was used to being his own boss and running the team his way and just couldn't fit back into a corporate structure, or whatever reason he genuinely just didn't get on with the new management. Because of the deal with Alfa, though, he wasn't able to run the Ferrari emblem on cars for about 4 years after he finished. In 1940, he'd set up another racing organisation, producing his own cars. That business was the Auto Avio Costruzioni. They only managed to complete one car and enter one race, 1940 Mille Miglia, before, unfortunately, World War II broke out. That car Tipo 815. That car was raced by Alberto Ascari. With World War II breaking out, Enzo had to move his manufacturing plant from Modena to about 10 miles out of town to the small, sleepy suburb of Maranello in a bid to try and avoid it being bombed. And it's sort of strange how it's worked from there, really, when you consider how sort of emblematic and Maranello now is. And it could have been so different. 1947, Enzo would complete his first road car that could wear the Ferrari badge. That was the Tipo 125. Between then and the first race, the F1 calendar in 1950, when Ferrari would enter Grand Prix racing, they won 3 events. The Rome Grand Prix in 1947, the Mille Miglia in 1948, and the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1949. While Enzo had had success running Alfa Romeos in the 1930s, his own team, his own brand, his own production of cars was very new. They were still the upstarts at this point. So going into the 1950 season against Alfa Romeo, F1 was using the 1.5 litre cars, which Alfa Romeo had been the masters of pre-war. So they could base their technology very heavily on established technology that they had. Ferrari weren't really in with a shout in 1950. In fact, all the races, with the exception of the Indy 500 in the 1950 season, were won by Alfa Romeos. 1951, the start of that looked like being a very similar affair. The first 3 races, I think it was, being won by Alfa Romeo. And then it turned. For Ferrari to be an established, seriously taken proposition, it had to beat Alfa Romeo, it had to beat the might of Maserati. And in 1951 that started happening. Halfway through the season it all came together. At the 5th round at Silverstone, Ferrari got its first win in Grand Prix racing, which would be followed by 2 further wins. When Enzo was asked how it felt to beat Alfa Romeo, he said it was like killing his mother, such was the fondness he'd had and how much he'd felt he owed to Alfa Romeo for all the career it had given him, the shot it had given him to get to where he was in the world at that point. But it was time for his own team to go on the rise. So following Silverstone, they'd win another 2 races and Alberto Ascari would finish second in the championship. Alfa Romeo, seeing what was going on, bolted. They ran. They didn't feel that they could compete anymore. The technology that they'd got had fallen behind Ferrari, and with the financial situation they were in, they didn't have the resources to develop further to try and stay in the fight. In the 52 season, they weren't there, and Ferrari won every race bar the Indy 500, with Alberto Ascari running the last 6 races in a row. Talking Fiat's best designer into going to Alfa Romeo in the 1920s had finished Fiat racing at Grand Prix levels. As his own team, he had now forced the withdrawal of the mighty Alfa Romeo themselves. With Maserati not really competing full time or with a full works effort, Ferrari then became the established dominant force in Italian motor racing. They were now the team to beat, and the legend had begun.